Hi everybody, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Nicole Lamberson. I trained as a physician assistant and I'm a member of the outreach team for the film Medicating Normal, and I host conversations like this one today. Our guest today is Michael Yapko, Ph.D. He is a clinical psychologist and marriage and family therapist who lives in Southern California. He is internationally recognized for his innovative work in treating depression with active, brief psychotherapies. He routinely teaches to professional audiences all over the world, and to date, he has been invited to present his ideas and methods to colleagues in more than 30 countries across 6 continents and all over the United States. He has special interest that spans nearly 5 decades in the intricacies of brief therapy, the clinical applications of directive and experiential methods, and proactively treating the disorder of major depression. His social view of depression has considerable empirical support and encourages multidimensional treatments. He is the author of 16 books, editor of 3 others, and numerous book chapters and journal articles on these subjects. More information about his work is available on his website at www.yapko.com, and we'll place his full bio and links in the description and comment section below for anybody who wants to visit them. So welcome, Dr. Yapko. Thank you so much for being here. We're so glad to have you today.
Thanks, Nicole. I appreciate it. Look forward to talking with you.
Sure. So is there anything before we start that I left out of your bio or that you would like to add? You saw the movie, anything like that to get started?
Well, I did see Medicating Normal, and I can say it was superb. I really appreciated the fact that they followed people through the challenges that they face in the wake of using medications that didn't work in their favor. And the expert opinions of the various guests were really right on. And so I'm glad to add to that body of work with this interview, and look forward to talking with you.
Okay, great. So I guess we'll jump right in. And I always want to know, once we, start talking to a new expert is, what led you to take interest in this? You were trained, formally as a clinical psychologist, marriage therapist, family therapist, but what about non-pharmacological treatment of depression was super interesting for you to start digging around there?
Well, I think that it was pretty obvious to me early on that here was a problem, namely depression, that was the most common mood disorder in the world, and there weren't any good treatments for it. At the time that I began, the only medications that there were medications that people didn't really want to take because they had annoying little side effects like death. And so this preceded, of course, the newer generation of antidepressants. But to see depression as such a common and prevalent condition certainly suggested to me right off the bat that this was very unlikely to be an entirely biological phenomenon, and to begin to explore, as I did, and develop an awareness for the multidimensional nature of depression, the fact that there are so many psychological factors that contribute and so many social factors that contribute. It became apparent to me right away that medication, even if and when it provided some relief to people, was at best a partial solution. That by definition, when you treat a problem that is multidimensional on only one dimensional, namely biologically, that it's by definition under treatment. And so looking at the realm of psychotherapy, the psychotherapeutic methods weren't very well advanced either, and there just weren't good treatments available. And so recognizing that this is such a prevalent problem and wanting to do something about it, my focus became, how can we develop effective treatments that could work relatively quickly that didn't have side effects?
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So just for people who, maybe have never had it or they're not super familiar with it, you talked about all these different risk factors for depression, biological, social, psychological, but, what is depression? What causes it? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, it's a big question, and there's really not a very specific answer to it.
Mhm.
Technically, depression is defined as a mood disorder, and yet it is far more than that. The tentacles of depression reach into virtually every aspect of a person's life. It affects the way that they relate to other people. It affects their performance on the job. It affects their view of themselves and the quality of their life. It affects their decision-making processes. It affects, I can go on and on with all the different ways depression affects people's lives. And so if we ask who's vulnerable to depression, the answer is everybody. That if you're capable of a mood, you're capable of a mood disorder.
Mhm.
So I've been particularly interested in the notion of risk factors. And when I first started studying depression so many years ago, as I mentioned, there weren't any good psychotherapeutic treatments. There weren't any good biological treatments.
Mhm.
And so here's a problem that was very widely prevalent without any good solutions to it. So it became really important to develop a realistic way of thinking about it. And so there are many different contributing factors, and I can specify some of those later if you want me to. But the notion of risk factors, when I began, as I said, there weren't treatments. The idea of prevention was fantasy.
Yeah.
And fortunately, over the course of my professional lifetime, we have learned enough about depression that for the majority of people who suffer with it, if they go for help, they'll get it. They're very likely to get effective help that'll make a big difference for them. But I think the biggest change is having developed prevention strategies and then being able to demonstrate that they actually work. And that is, I think, one of the most powerful statements about where we are right now, that depression's just not the mystery that it once was. Yes, there are still many unanswered questions, but there are a lot of things that we understand better now, such that we really could develop and implement realistic prevention strategies.
Okay. So once I started looking at my health sort of a little differently when I was forced to, I told you before we got started on this interview that I took psychiatric medication myself and I had all kinds of adverse effects and withdrawal syndromes. And so I was sort of forced to reevaluate my health, and look at how I could best support my body and that kind of thing. So I started studying about diet and all these things. And one thing that sort of stood out that made sense to me was looking at things kind of ancestrally or from an evolutionarily, perspective. Like, how did people used to eat long ago and how did that serve us? And when I look at anxiety makes sense to me evolutionarily, like fight or flight, why we need that. But what do you think depression, how does it serve us?
Well, there's quite a gap between the way evolutionary psychologists look at it and clinical psychologists look at it.
Mhm.
Evolutionary psychologists begin with the premise that it serves us in some way, and then they task themselves with trying to figure out or generate a plausible rationale for how it serves us.
Okay.
And I think if you go back throughout recorded history, people have been writing about depression forever, long before processed foods, long before sugar, long before all these things. Depression's been a constant. People were writing about depression 2,000 years ago. I don't take an evolutionary perspective. I recognize that what depression does is, if there's any advantage to it, for most people, what it will do is it will lead them to ask questions about the way they're living their lives. It'll lead them to ask questions about who am I and what are the choices that I'm making and how did I get here?
Mhm.
So if there is any advantage to it, it's the opportunity for revision. It's the opportunity for somebody to be able to say, here's what I'm doing in my life. Here's the way that I'm approaching things. And clearly they're not working. They're not making me feel good. They're not making my quality of life any better. And so even when people come to that realization, for some people, it will become quite apparent to them what they need to start to do differently in order to improve their outlook and their mood. And for other people, it is just a huge question mark. And that's when it's really helpful to go into therapy and have somebody with another perspective take a look at what's going on in your life and help you make some better decisions about the way you want to live, the way you want to be. So, in that sense, we could say depression represents an opportunity for change. And it's not something that somebody has to live with.
Gotcha. So then you mentioned, identifying the risk factors then was super important. So can you give us some, I'm sure there's countless,
Yeah.
but in the different categories, biological, social, psychological, what are some of the identified risk factors?
Well, let's first define what a risk factor is.
Okay.
Risk factor is anything that increases the likelihood of somebody suffering a particular disorder. So in the same way that we could say that somebody who smokes cigarettes is at an elevated risk for cardiovascular problems, lung cancer, and so forth, we could say that people who have these particular characteristics are at an elevated risk for depression. It's an important point for people to understand that by the time depression strikes in somebody's life, the risk factors had already been in place for years. Depression doesn't just strike out of the blue. For most people, the risk factors had been in place for years, and somebody knowledgeable about what those risk factors are could point to them and say, here's what your particular risk profile really is. So, I recognize that there are three domains that contribute to depression. One is biological. And while I would say that biology has been overestimated, there isn't a gene for depression. There are genes that make you vulnerable to depression, but there aren't genes that make you depressed. And yet, biology does matter. Clearly, there are diseases where depression is a predictable consequence. There are medications that you can take and drugs that you can take where depression is a predictable side effect. So there are biological influences, but these have been vastly overstated in the service of getting people to take medications. So by telling people you have this biochemical imbalance in your brain or a shortage of serotonin, you need to take this drug to regulate your brain. And we'll talk about just how wrong that perspective is, I'm sure, a little bit later on. But okay, so some of the risk factors are biological. Poor diet, lack of exercise, these are all things that contribute, and they fall in the biological realm. In the psychological realm, how you are as a problem solver, your level of problem solving skill. The great American humorist Mark Twain notably said that life is one damn thing after another. And he was right about that. And we have plenty of evidence to show that the people who are better problem solvers do better in life than the people who just fold when they face adversity. And so how people cope with stress is another risk factor, whether people take better care of themselves when they're stressed or whether they do more self-destructive things like drink too much and eat too much and veg out on the couch just watching endless hours of television. So coping style represents a risk factor. And one of the most important risk factors is what's called a cognitive style, a way of thinking, a style of thinking, and specifically what's called a global cognitive style. One of the things that we know about people who are more vulnerable to depression is that and anxiety as well, I should add, is that they tend to have what's called a global cognitive style. They tend to think in overgeneral terms. So when they face a negative event, instead of saying, well, gee, that was a bummer, instead they say, life is so unfair. They take it to a much bigger perspective. And they don't really have the specifics of how to deal with the things that happen. So they just globally become paralyzed with indecision and fear and doubt and all those kinds of things. And then in the social domain, culture matters, family matters, the kinds of interactional patterns, that relationships are certainly negatively affected by depression. People who are unrealistic in their expectations, and so they're always disappointed by other people. People who don't have the social skills to build positive relationships and maintain them. And so, if we look at the common denominators of all of these risk factors, I'd say number one on the list is what's called an internal orientation. The person who uses their thoughts and their feelings as the frame of reference. They think that the way that they think about things is the way things really are. They think that their perspective about things is the way things really are. And that's one of the most dangerous traps there is, because we can so easily convince ourselves that something is the way we think it is. And it becomes one of the most sophisticated skills that you can develop in life. Here's what I think's going on, but how do I know? And is there any evidence for it, to be able to engage in a process of greater reality testing, to be able to challenge your own point of view. How else could I look at this? How else could I respond to this? And so that internal orientation is what people bring into their relationships. It's what they bring into their own decision-making. It's what they bring into even the decision as to whether to pursue medication or not, or therapy or not. So a lot of different risk factors, and mention at least some of the major ones.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So for the psychological and social ones, we had an expert here recently that was talking a lot about parents and how they affect their children and that kind of thing. Are those sort of like, can you predict that someone might have less of a risk of depression because of certain things they were taught as a child, or stable household and that kind of thing?
Yeah. It's a great question, Nicole, because it's a very fertile area of research. One of the risk factors that I didn't mention is what's called attributional style, which is just a patterned way of learning to interpret life experience. So if you think about, how a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old might ask several thousand times a day, why, mommy? Why, daddy? Why do I have to do that? Why? And, parents get really tired of having to answer why. But of course, every explanation you give has embedded within it what's called an attribution, an explanation. And it's no coincidence that a child's attributional style is very, very closely related to the parent's attributional style. It's what you would expect. You learn to interpret the world through the things that you're taught by the people who are significant in your life. So initially it's the family, and then of course it becomes teachers and other people who become significant. But that role of how a parent raises a child makes all the difference in the world. And we certainly know just from the field of epidemiology, the study of prevalence, that the child of a depressed parent is anywhere from 3 to 6 times more likely to suffer depression than the child of a non-depressed parent. In fact, one of the books that I wrote was on this very topic. It was called Hand-Me-Down Blues. And it was the first book to really look at how does parenting increase or decrease vulnerability to depression in children. So do you raise your child to be a believer, or do you raise your child to be a thinker? If there was any one specific skill that I would want parents to teach their children, it's how to be a critical thinker, how to gather and use information, how to question yourself. Here's what I think. How do I know whether it's really true or not? And to be able to encourage children to see things from multiple perspectives. This 6-year-old kid comes home from school and is tearful because Johnny wouldn't play with me at recess today. Well, why do you think Johnny didn't play with you? Johnny doesn't like me. Can you generate any other reasons why Johnny might not have wanted to play with you today?
Yeah.
And, to be able to encourage multiple perspectives, alternate explanations. And are any of the explanations provable or not? Makes a difference.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have to live with, I don't really know why Johnny didn't want to play with me today. A great skill of tolerating ambiguity.
Yeah.
How a parent deals with the adversities in their own life. When mom and dad get in a fight, does dad leave and go to the bar and get drunk? Does mom start slamming cupboard doors? Do they yell and scream at each other and call each other names? What's the atmosphere in the house like? And you learn a lot about social skills, relationship skills, problem-solving skills within the context of a relationship through the family.
Mhm.
So, it's not right exactly to say your family causes your depression. It's not that linear, but there's no doubt that many of the things that you come to learn and understand about life come to you through your family. And that's part of any person's responsibility then as they get older. Do you recognize the limitations of what you learned in your family? Do you recognize what your mom and dad couldn't teach you? Obviously people can't teach you what they don't know. And so it's an important thing to recognize the limitations and not be blaming or angry about it, but it's an opportunity then, how else can I learn those skills? Handling an argument well, and I didn't learn that from my parents. How else can I learn to handle an argument well so that I could be in a long-term relationship that's healthy and positive and helps me use the skills to keep it healthy?
Yeah. Okay. All of that makes total sense.
Mhm.
So when we talk about medication, I believe it was in one of your presentations that I watched, you said medications have the highest rate of relapse of any form of treatment for depression. Yet when I look around, I see a lot of overprescription and using medications almost solely, as first line treatment.
Yeah.
With no mention of anything else. I'm sure this is a super complicated answer too, but why do you think we sort of landed on that approach?
This was it was one of the most unfortunate aspects. Up until the time that Prozac came out in the late 80s, drugs were only advertised directly to physicians. There was not a direct-to-consumer advertising. This changed markedly. I sometimes measure time in terms of BP and AP before Prozac and after Prozac, because Prozac entered the world with a huge splash. If people go back, they'll see that Prozac was featured on magazine covers like US News and World Report and Newsweek. There was a book called Listening to Prozac, written by the psychiatrist Peter Kramer, that was essentially an elaborate Valentine to the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company. And it was on the bestseller list, New York Times bestseller list, for more than 70 weeks. Unheard of, a book about a drug. And so there was a lot of hype about the drug. Peter Kramer wrote that Prozac will make you better than well, quote, and who doesn't want to be better than well?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, everybody knew the name Prozac. They had been told the rationale that this was about a shortage of serotonin. And it was a great marketing tool. People became so casual about it that they referred to it as vitamin P. And so all of a sudden, drug manufacturers were now marketing these drugs directly to consumers. You could literally stop anybody on the street and say, hey, what causes depression? And there's a very good chance they would say, oh, everybody knows it's a shortage of serotonin. That became the language that was so common. And the advertising works. You tell somebody something enough times and they start to believe it. And here are the ads where, in the first frame, here's this person, in black and white, staring out the window, looking at the rain, looking forlorn. And then they take their drug, and then the next frame, the sun's shining and they're smiling and everything's, it just presented such an unrealistic image. And psychiatrists, the whole psychiatric profession got behind it really quickly. This was something that they could do, prescribe medications that psychologists and other mental health professionals couldn't. So it became their reason to be, so to speak. But even the American psychiatric profession itself provided guidelines that said treatment is best when it's a combined treatment, medication and psychotherapy. That's even on the American Psychiatric Association website. But unfortunately, the majority of antidepressants are not prescribed by psychiatrists. They're prescribed by general practitioners, by cardiologists, by internists, by endocrinologists. More than 70% of antidepressants are prescribed by non-psychiatric professionals. And so they get the prescription. They're not told to get psychotherapy along with it. The majority of people receive it as a sole form of treatment. And that was what the data that I was citing was, that when a drug is prescribed as the only form of intervention, the sole form of treatment, that's when the relapse rate is at its highest. Just taking the drug alone is not an adequate response. And by now, it should start to become apparent to viewers as to why that's the case. To be very specific about it, no amount of medication can teach you coping skills. No amount of medication can teach you problem-solving skills. No amount of medication can teach you social skills. No amount of medication can change the bad things that have happened in your personal history. No amount of medication can help you build a realistic and compelling future. No amount of medication is going to teach you the things that need to be learned if someone is going to not only overcome depression, but learn to regulate it. Now, depression is a recurrent phenomenon. And for some people, their idea is it's recurrent because that's the nature of the beast. That's just the way depression is. I have a different viewpoint about it. I don't think that it's the nature of the beast. I don't think it's depression that's recurrent. I think it's life that's recurrent. None of us face disappointment only once. None of us face rejection only once. None of us face loss only once. That if you're alive, you're going to be facing tough things over the course of your lifetime. And if every time you face an adversity, your response to it is to get depressed, then you're going to get depressed a lot. That's why it's so important for people to learn the kinds of skills that I advocate, to be able to face and handle skillfully the kinds of things that happen in life without succumbing to the despair and the apathy that's so typical of depression. People get overwhelmed by bad things happening, and obviously I understand that. I've been treating depressed individuals, couples, families for nearly half a century, and working as deeply as I do, and not only working with people and helping them, but researching and writing, to have a really deep perspective about what's going on with depression. I don't say it lightly, that people need to learn the kinds of skills that are known to not only reduce severity and frequency of depression, but even prevent relapses.
I know you're not an expert on, pharmacology.
You just froze, Nicole.
Oh, still hear and see you. Can you hear and see me, or am I still frozen?
Yeah, you got clear again.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
I was saying, I realize you're not an expert in pharmacology or a pharmacologist, but one of the sort of hypotheses on antidepressants, or, why they might work, I guess you have to define what work means, right? But is that they have like a numbing effect. And I hear people all the time say, well, sometimes if somebody's like depressed enough, maybe in the beginning phases, medication might help in order to get them to the phase of where they could have therapy. But if numbing is the way that it's working, just say hypothetically,
Mhm.
how then do you think someone could benefit from psychotherapy? Because don't we need to be able to access our emotions, our true, genuine emotions, in order to have beneficial therapy? Or is that not the case in your opinion?
Well, the numbing that some people describe is an interesting phenomenon, and it's not certainly not very well understood, and certainly not understood in terms of prevalence, and whether it's even a real phenomenon or an artifact of the way people are told to expect it to work. But emotional numbing is something that doesn't just happen with antidepressants. It happens in a variety of ways when people feel overwhelmed, when people are traumatized, when people just get detached from experience as a way of coping. And of course, the premise is that if I don't detach, if I don't numb myself, then I'm not going to be able to deal with these things. So being able to recognize and manage your emotions is absolutely highly desirable. We don't want people numb, whether it's through chemical means or through any psychological coping means. But at the same time, we have to always address the question, is this person able to recognize and manage their emotions? Do they have the skills for not getting overwhelmed even when emotions get intense? And that's something that it would be very difficult for somebody to evaluate on their own. Again, here's something that is a good reason to talk to a therapist of, here's what's going on with me, here's how I'm coping with it, here's what I'm feeling detached from and numbed by, and to then be able to carve out a path for how to have a more realistic connection to what you're feeling becomes a viable therapeutic goal, a realistic therapeutic goal. But this is part of the whole mythology about antidepressants. If you had the guy here who invented Prozac and you asked him, so how exactly does that work? He'd be the first to say, I have no idea. We don't know what the mechanisms are, and that's part of the problem. Now, in trying to explain it and giving people the rationale that here's how the drug works in order to make it sound scientific, can be satisfying to people, but there's a difference between something that sounds plausible versus something that's actually true. Do we need to explain how it works in order for us to recognize any potential benefits? Well, there are a lot of things that we don't know how they work, and yet we still know how to use them. There's people still trying to figure out how aspirin works. It doesn't mean that we don't know how to use it properly. But the issue that has come up recently because of the research questioning the chemical imbalance theory is, do we need to know how something works in order to be able to make good use of it? And different people, I suppose, would answer that differently.
Yeah. Okay. So, we've talked about how antidepressants then have these limitations, and you say there's great advantages to psychotherapy. So, maybe let's talk about if medicine alone isn't the answer, what can people with depression do? How can they help themselves? Is it just psychotherapy, or what are some of the things you suggest?
Well, given that, as I mentioned, anybody is vulnerable. Now, the idea, of course, is to recognize what are your own risk factors, what are your own vulnerabilities. Wherever there is the opportunity to act preventively, that would be great. Learning anxiety management tools, learning mood regulation skills, developing those skills. But once you're in the throes of depression, one of the characteristics of depression, of course, is apathy. If depression was a commercial product, its advertising slogan would be, why bother? Why bother to go for help? Why bother to read the self-help books? Why bother? And that's when people end up just kind of suffering in silence, thinking that this is just the way things are. But of course, why bother is just a perspective, and it's a depressed perspective. This is one of the things that has fascinated me the most about studying depression and studying the mindset of people who are depressed, is that people justify the apathy with their own negative expectations. Why should I go for help? No one's ever going to be able to help me. Why should I read the self-help books? What can somebody who doesn't even know me tell me that's going to be helpful to me? Why should I bother? And the answer is because the answer is out there. That to be able to gather information, to be able to learn perspectives that challenge your own view of yourself, that's what people can do to help themselves. And there are wonderful self-help materials. And even for people who go into psychotherapy, they still need to do self-help. It's talking to a therapist, for an hour here, an hour there is going to be helpful, but it's not in place of all the things you still have to do independently. Hopefully the exercises that you're given to help you build specific skills. Now, I've written 2 self-help books myself. One is called Breaking the Patterns of Depression. The other is called Depression is Contagious. And I provide all kinds of exercises for people to develop specific skills. But first, you would have to know what skills you're trying to learn. Where are your weaknesses? And to be honest with yourself. But as soon as you take the position, well, why should I bother? Nothing's going to make a difference. Then you're sealing your own fate unrealistically. When I said earlier that for the people who go for help, they're very likely to get it. Depression is highly treatable when you're talking to someone who actually knows what they're doing. And therapy is not a long drawn out process of talking about your childhood and your toilet training and doing dream analysis and all kinds of stuff that has long fallen by the wayside. Therapy these days is generally pretty quick. When I say quick, 6 to 12 sessions is typical. And it's a very active process of go in there, focus on, what are the problems? What are the skills that need to be learned to solve those problems? What are the things that I can do in between sessions? And one of the things that's happened over the last couple of years because of the pandemic, therapy has gone to telehealth, where people from the comfort of their own home can have therapy sessions across Zoom. And the research has been very substantial now to show that by doing therapy that way, it doesn't lose anything in terms of its therapeutic value. Now, that's a really important finding across dozens of studies. You don't have to be in the same room with a therapist in order to get the benefit. But the other thing that's new, that's made a difference, is the use of phone apps that are mental health phone apps. Now, over the last 3 years, I've been consulting heavily with a particular phone app called Mindset. And this has been a really interesting thing because when they first approached me about participating and contributing to a telephone app, my immediate reaction was, you got to be kidding me. Who's going to do mental health on a phone?
Yeah.
And then as the data started to come in about how many people were using these apps and what benefits they claimed from these apps, it became very convincing. And I started to get it very directly involved with it and keeping track of the data of the programs that I've been contributing. And just amazing to me, the large volume of listeners and the benefits that they report from totally impersonal apps. Obviously, the app isn't meant for you the way your therapy is meant for you. So there are lots of things that people can do to help themselves. And the important thing, one last thought, is the myth that somehow you get cured from depression and then you're done. The reason that's a myth is for as long as you have moods, you're going to have to practice mood management. You don't cure depression, you learn to manage depression. The same way that you learn to manage other parts of your life. You don't exercise once and now you're done with exercise. You
I
don't,
wish.
yeah, you don't make a
Someday.
bank deposit once and now you're done with managing your finances. You
Mhm.
don't discipline your kid once and now you're done with parenting.
Yeah.
These are things that you're constantly having to do. And the same is true with managing your mood. You are constantly having to protect yourself and make smart decisions about where you go and what you do and who you bring into your life and how you do the things that you do. And that's why the insight part of this, the self-understanding, is so critically important. And so often the pathway into people's depression comes from the lack of self-understanding. People who don't know their own nature well enough to honor it and work with it. And instead, they put themselves into situations where, in terms of temperament and character, they just don't belong there. And then they find themselves there and they're struggling and feel terrible. It's one of the most important things that you can develop is a realistic understanding of yourself, your strengths, as well as your vulnerabilities, and how to build your life around your strengths and learning how to minimize your risks.
Okay. So you're talking about, depression is easily treatable and that,
I didn't say easily treatable, but I
well,
said
it is
definitely.
treatable. Yes, definitely. Sorry. It's nothing about what you said is easy, actually. Yes. But how do you find a therapist or psychologist? What, traits are you looking for? Are there good ones and bad ones? Yeah.
Like any profession, there are some who are more skilled and experienced than others. And so, I think the first thing that you want to make sure you're looking for is someone who is licensed, because only by being licensed are they accountable for the quality of the work that they do. And so seeing somebody who's a licensed psychologist, a licensed marriage family therapist, a licensed professional counselor, a licensed clinical social worker, there's a range of mental health licenses. And the academic degree, whether they have a master's degree or a Ph.D. or a PsyD or an MD, is far less important than the nature of the person that you're dealing with. Is this somebody who really understands the nature of depression?
Okay.
Or is this somebody who just provides simplistic, gee, you've had a tough childhood and that's why you're depressed? Or gee, you recently lost your job and that's why you're depressed? Those kinds of simple cause-effect statements reflect somebody who really doesn't understand the multidimensional nature of depression or the risk factors of depression. So any therapist you're going to see is going to be willing to talk to you briefly on the phone first. Here's your opportunity to ask questions and get a feel for who this person is and how they approach things. And it's perfectly legitimate to ask the person, okay, can you describe some of your philosophy of treatment? Can you describe some of your approaches to treatment? Can you describe some of your experience in treating depression? Can you explain some of what the therapeutic process is and what I should expect? And those are reasonable questions to ask, and any therapist worth their weight is going to be able to answer those things. No, they're not going to spend a full hour on the phone with you, but they're certainly going to be willing to spend 10 or 15 minutes knowing that you're being an intelligent consumer, and they want to encourage that. They want you to come into therapy knowing what to expect so that you'll appreciate the experience instead of being disappointed by it.
Mhm.
So checking out somebody's credentials. Every state has a licensing board that you can go to their website and you can plug in somebody's name and find out whether they have any lawsuits against them, whether they've had any complaints against them, to find out, what the reputation is of this person. It's always best when you get a referral from somebody that you trust.
Mhm.
But even when you go in for a first appointment, that doesn't mean you're committed to work with this person forever. You now have a full session, and you'll notice how much time do they spend just asking questions? How much time do they spend actually giving you advice? Do they provide an action orientation? Not all therapies are equal. We have plenty of evidence to show that the therapies that require people to be active in the treatment process do way better than the therapies where the person just sits there and complains.
Mhm.
So that means we want the therapist to provide homework assignments, things to read, things to do that will help you acquire the frame of mind and acquire the skills that will be helpful to you in the long run. You should expect homework to be given at each session for you to carry out in between sessions. And of course, it's to your advantage to do that homework, to start to develop the skills that you recognize and your therapist recognizes are skills that need to be developed.
Mhm.
So reading self-help books along the way is an important thing to do. And again, not all books are of equal value. I mentioned my books. I'll mention another one by David Burns called Feeling Good. I'll mention another one by Christine Podesky and Dennis Greenberger called Mind Over Mood. These are excellent books that provide very credible information and a lot of structure for how to acquire the skills known to reduce depression and even prevent relapses.
Okay.
So the question's a good one about how to shop for a therapist. And then the other things, of course, that they're available for regular appointments.
Mhm.
You'd have to check out what the insurance coverage is. Different insurances provide different coverages for different types of clinical licenses. And, those kinds of things. But you want it to be supportive therapy, but at the same time, really focused on being action-oriented, skill building, and that's what you're looking for.
Okay. Yeah. So essentially we can't take a passive role. We have to be our own best health advocates. And we have
Exactly
to
right.
learn about ourselves and research what kind of risk factors we have. And then, we also have to investigate what kind of therapy we're getting and who the therapist is and all of that.
Yeah,
So,
all of
okay.
that. You summarized it well. This is the value of information.
Mhm.
And when I talked earlier about the main problem for depressed people is that they think things and then make the mistake of believing themselves,
Mhm.
that all of these things that you just summarized so well are ways of going outside yourself to gather information to help you make more realistic decisions.
Okay.
This is one of the things that we know from a field of research called cognitive neuroscience
Mhm.
and a parallel field called affective neuroscience. These are fields that study how do your thinking processes influence your mood states, and conversely, how do your mood states influence your thinking processes. So when people make bad decisions based on their depression,
Mhm.
your partner says to you, gee, I think you should go for help, and you tell your partner to shut up and leave me alone. That's a bad decision.
Mhm.
And it's going to have some profound implications. And when you make the decision based on your mood that ends up precluding getting the help you need, that's how mood states can make decision-making processes warped in the direction of maintaining depression and even making it worse.
Yeah. Yeah. So our film Medicating Normal takes a critical view on psychiatric medications, especially as first lines of treatment or in the long term.
Yes.
We have somebody who follows us on YouTube that constantly leaves comments saying, well, it's great to point all these things out, but let's be realistic, right? Like medicine can be super cheap for some people, and all of these therapies and alternatives and things can be expensive. And she says, I'd like to know, what do people who don't have resources, who don't have money, what can they do to help themselves?
Almost every university has counseling centers that provide either free or sliding scale services. Almost every community, county, state has services that are provided free or on a sliding scale basis. The idea that you have to have a lot of money, well, yeah, if you're going to see private therapists who are expensive, then yeah, you're going to need a lot of money, but that's not the only choice available to you.
Okay.
And so, you can say medication is cheaper, but certainly not in the long run. And studies have examined this as well, that if you compare psychotherapy to medication, yes, in the short run, medication is cheaper, but it isn't when you add in all the relapses and you add in all the side effects that people go in for treatment with. And when you look at the kinds of side effects that lead people into emergency rooms, the most common reason for people going into emergency rooms. And so in the long run, psychotherapy actually turns out to be a less expensive proposition, lower rates of relapses, and obviously no biological side effects. But all it takes is a little bit of research to find county-supported places, state-supported places, university-supported places that provide counseling at no fee or a sliding scale fee. That, to see a therapist for an hour for $5 is not unrealistic. It just depends where you are. And again, especially these days with the telehealth, it's not even like in the days 5 years ago where you had to physically go there and you didn't have rides and you couldn't afford a taxi and all that kind of stuff. All of that has changed. Therapy is more accessible now than it has ever been. And with phone apps as another alternative, where for a very cheap subscription rate of $60, $70 a year, you can have unlimited access to scores and scores and scores of therapy sessions and helpful programs. There are lots of things that people can do to help themselves. And, the excuse that I can't afford it just doesn't wash anymore.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned a little bit previously in our talk about the new research that's all over the news lately. It's the systematic umbrella study that sort of debunks the myth of the low serotonin hypothesis of depression. And for anyone unfamiliar, we'll put it in the comments or description. So what was your thinking when you first saw this study hitting the mainstream media? I mean, I saw a lot of people in expert, positions or doctors saying like, we already knew that, but do you think the patients knew or?
Yeah. Mental health professionals by and large already knew that. In fact, when Prozac first came out and they were looking for ways to fund further research and promote it, it was literally a meeting of the minds where they decided, well, let's say it's about a shortage of serotonin. And in fact, one of the most prominent drug researchers at the time was at that meeting and described to me what it was like to hear this totally plausible but false perspective being promoted to give a scientific sounding reason for prescribing Prozac and the newer generation antidepressants. But we have known for a very long time that it's not about serotonin. In fact, in France, they widely prescribe a drug that has the exact opposite mechanism, that instead of increasing serotonin levels, it actually decreases serotonin levels. And guess what? It has the exact same treatment success rate. So yeah, we've known for a long time that this was just a marketing tool, that it wasn't a realistic explanation. But that really begs the larger issue. You have people who say, these drugs saved my life. And I believe them when they say that. I'm not going to discount it and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. They're the ones who enjoyed the benefit. So all it really tells us is that how a repetitive mantra, depression is caused by a shortage of serotonin, if you say it enough times, people will believe it. And the fact that the great majority of people have been given the drug on the basis of a plausible but unproven theory just tells you how much faith people have placed in their prescribers, that they have listened to this without doing any research on their own to find out whether it's really true. And that's why you're seeing, for many people, the backlash. There are a lot of people who have publicly expressed how angry they are about this, how they feel betrayed and misled. And others who say, I don't care if the theory turns out to be wrong, but the drug is still effective, I'm okay with it. So you have a wide range of reactions to it. But what should most come out of this is that people really understand that we don't know how these drugs work. You can't be given a scientific explanation for them. You can only be given, hypotheses and theories that may or may not eventually be proven true or false. And what matters the most is understanding that whatever the rationale is for taking the drug, to understand the limitations, to approach these drugs realistically, to understand what a placebo effect is and what it means when you read the data that say that the drugs aren't significantly more effective than placebos, and the inert substances that don't have any true medicinal value. So when people approach it realistically, knowing that this isn't a complete treatment by itself, when they take the responsibility for recognizing which specific skills they need to learn and what their own vulnerabilities are, and they can approach treatment with insight instead of wish fulfillment, that's when they're going to do better.
Yeah. Okay. I saw in your recent newsletter that you put out, you announced about the 988 suicide and crisis Lifeline, and I had seen it advertised on social media and stuff. It wasn't surprising to me, but I'm wondering if it's surprising to you that there were some articles in like USA Today where some mental health advocates, were coming out saying like, don't call this number, it's not safe. Basically, I think they're worried that when people utilize resources like that, they're at risk for involuntary hospitalization and being medicated against their will. And then there was one statistic listed in one of the articles that those who were sent involuntarily were actually more likely to attempt suicide than those who chose to go. Or like you go against your will and you're stuck with large treatment bills after the fact. So do you think this is a big problem with these suicide hotlines, or should people still, utilize them?
This is going to be a very individual matter, of course, and like all things, you have to approach it realistically. They rolled this thing out without a really good net in place to catch people. They're following protocols that in many cases don't make much sense, but it depends who you end up on the phone with. That's part of it. These people who get rudimentary training to follow certain protocols, and they're not thinking their way through it. They're not even necessarily experienced. They may be compassionate people and empathetic people, but they're not trained people in the best of ways. And so again, if you were going to call a hotline like that, and this is a government hotline, there have been other hotlines that have been in existence for how many decades already that people could call. You don't necessarily have to share all the details of where you are and just how suicidal you are, and all those kinds of things that might be too revealing. But you first get a chance to ask some questions. That before I open up and start telling you what's going on with me, tell me what to expect here. Am I going to get advice from you? Am I going to get support from you? Am I going to end up with the police at my door if you are too worried about me? Or what's going to happen here?
Yeah.
And every step of the way, the best treatment you get is when you are an informed consumer. So I think that the idea of a national suicide hotline is well-intentioned, but because it's so new, because it hasn't gotten its footing yet, it's still a little on the sloppy side. But when you think about for people who are genuinely suicidal, who are this far away from taking a swan dive off a roof someplace, we want to. The goal is to save lives in whatever way we could possibly can. But still, it does fall upon anyone to be an intelligent consumer. Find out what you're getting into before you get into it.
Yeah, makes total sense. Well, I'm conscious of the time here. We've talked for an hour and I feel like I could sit and talk for another one, but I want to let you get on with your day. I'm so glad to have learned from you, and you've inspired me. I kind of want to go now, and I am going to get your books and look into what my own risk factors for depression are. So what would be the best book to dig into to find all of the risk factors listed and analyze myself if I wanted to?
My most popular book, hands down, is a book called Breaking the Patterns of Depression.
Okay.
More recently, I wrote a book called Keys to Unlocking Depression, which is just a summary of key points that anybody who's dealing with depression should know these things. And so people can go to my website, yapko.com, and they'll find it there. They'll also find it on Amazon, of course. And people are free to, when they go to my website, they're free to sign up for my newsletter and see past newsletters that I've posted with current information, things that I think people should know. So I'm hoping to be a continuing source of good information. In the near future, my website's going to be going through an update and upgrade.
Nice.
And so more information will be added still, but I hope people will find all that information helpful to them.
Yeah, sure. And we'll post links to Dr. Yapko's books and his LinkedIn, his YouTube channel, his website, all of those things in the comments and description for everybody to research themselves.
Great.
So I guess before we go, do you have any last closing thoughts that you want to leave with anybody listening?
Yeah, I hope that I have sparked some optimism in people to have a realistic basis for understanding that depression is treatable, that a lot of the things that contribute to depression we understand quite well, that a good therapist is worth their weight in platinum, but good information is incredibly valuable, and I hope people will pursue it. And I think that we want to make sure that people make informed decisions, that they understand the implications of information that they gather. And the idea isn't to slam any one approach or get enthusiastic about any one approach.
Mm-hmm.
There are many pathways into depression. There are many pathways out. And I just want each person to be knowledgeable enough to carve a path for themselves that makes sense. And more important than that, actually works. So I want to thank you, Nicole, for doing this interview with me. I really appreciate it. Mm-hmm. And to all the folks who put together Medicating Normal, my hat's off to you. You did a superb job of highlighting what the issues are. And I hope people will avail themselves of that information.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah. One more thing before you go, just thinking, it popped in my head, the 1-800 number type thing. We can help each other with depression, right? By just being present and connected as human beings. Being
supportive helps. It always helps to have supportive friends and family. But support by itself isn't enough. Again, there's a reason why I have emphasized from the time this interview began, skills. And the skills that people need to acquire, and especially these days when critical thinking is not being encouraged, when people are getting lost in conspiracy theories and all kinds of misinformation, it becomes even more important that people develop the skills for how to gather and use information, how to connect with people in ways that are healthy and positive, how to be realistic about what to expect in themselves and in life experience. So there's a reason why I've been advocating skills from the time that this began. And so, building a support network is one of those skills.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'll just read our little closing spiel here. Thanks everybody who joined us today for this live discussion. If you have not seen Medicating Normal and you would like to, you can go to medicatingnormal.com/watch for the many ways to view. You can also buy the film on DVD if you're in the United States and Puerto Rico. As always, check our events tab on Facebook for more upcoming interviews like this one. And lastly, if you want to support our outreach efforts to bring the film to communities worldwide, you can make a donation at medicatingnormal.com/donate. So thanks again, Dr. Yapko, and to our listeners, and keep in touch. We'll
All
talk
right.
soon. All right.
Thanks so much. Take
All
care.
right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.